in the scorching heat of the Arabian Peninsula, where the sun beats down mercilessly on endless dunes and the wind carries whispers of forgotten civilizations, archaeologists made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. This wasn't just another ancient settlement buried beneath the sand. This wasn't some routine excavation that would add a footnote to history textbooks. What they uncovered in the summer of 2023 was something that defied explanation. A city so perfectly preserved, so impossibly intact, that it seemed as though its inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air just moments before the team arrived. But here's what makes this discovery truly chilling. Every single person who worked on the initial excavation reported the same unsettling experiences. Tools would move on their own. Voices echoed from empty chambers. And most disturbing of all, the deeper they dug, the more they realized this ancient city held secrets that perhaps were never meant to see the light of day. My name is Sarah, and I've spent the last 15 years documenting archaeological discoveries around the world. I've stood in the shadow of the pyramids, walked through the ruins of Pompeii, and explored burial chambers that hadn't been opened for thousands of years. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I'm about to share with you today. Because what happened in that cursed city buried beneath the Arabian sands wasn't just a breakthrough in archaeology. It was a warning. Over the next several videos in this series, I'm going to take you deep into one of the most disturbing archaeological discoveries of our time. We'll examine the physical evidence that has experts baffled, explore the psychological toll this site took on everyone who worked there, and investigate the mysterious circumstances that led to the excavation being abruptly shut down by authorities. But most importantly, we'll try to answer the question that keeps me awake at night. What really happened to the people of this ancient city, and why does their fate feel like a prophecy for our own? The story begins 6 months ago when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned archaeologist from the University of Barcelona, received a call that would change everything. A construction crew working on a new highway project had struck something unusual beneath the sand. Not unusual like pottery shards or old coins, unusual like perfectly preserved wooden beams, and what appeared to be an intact city gate. The Saudi authorities, recognizing the potential significance of the find, immediately halted construction and contacted international archaeological teams. Dr. Vasquez assembled her team within weeks. She brought together experts in ancient Middle Eastern civilizations, carbon dating specialists, and ground-penetrating radar technicians. This was supposed to be the discovery of a lifetime, a chance to uncover a lost civilization that could rewrite our understanding of ancient trade routes and early urban development in the Arabian Peninsula. But from the moment they arrived at the site, something felt wrong. The first sign came during the initial survey. The ground-penetrating radar revealed something that shouldn't have been possible. The city wasn't just partially preserved, it was completely intact. Streets, buildings, courtyards, even what appeared to be furniture inside homes. It was as if someone had taken a thriving ancient city and simply covered it with sand, preserving it like a time capsule. Dr. Vasquez later told me in an interview that she'd never seen anything like it. In her own words, archaeological sites are messy, buildings collapse, materials decay, civilizations build on top of older settlements. But this city looked like its inhabitants had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. The team began their excavation with standard protocols. They divided the site into grids, documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, and started the careful process of removing centuries of accumulated sand. What they found in those first few days was remarkable. Pottery that looked like it had been fired yesterday, textiles that should have crumbled to dust but remained surprisingly intact, and most incredibly, organic materials like wood and leather that had somehow survived in near-perfect condition. But it was the absence of something that began to unsettle the team. Where were the bodies? In any ancient city, you expect to find human remains. Whether from natural deaths, conflicts, or disasters, Archaeological sites typically yield skeletal evidence of their former inhabitants. But as the team uncovered house after house, street after street, they found something far more disturbing than bodies. They found evidence of interrupted lives, meals left half-eaten on tables, children's toys scattered on floors, personal belongings left exactly where their owners had placed them, as if everyone had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. Dr. James Mitchell, the team's forensic archaeologist, described the scene to me like this. Imagine walking into your neighbor's house and finding everything exactly as they left it, but no sign of where they went or why. Now imagine that scenario, but the house has been empty for over 1,000 years. The carbon dating results only deepened the mystery. The city dated to approximately 800 to 900 CE, placing it during a period of significant trade and cultural exchange in the region. This should have been a thriving time for urban settlements along ancient trade routes. Yet there was no record of this city in any historical texts, no mention of it in trade documents or travel accounts from the period. It was as if this place had been deliberately erased from history. As the excavation progressed, the team began to uncover evidence of the city's final days, and what they found raised more questions than answers. In several buildings, they discovered what appeared to be barricades hastily constructed from furniture and debris. Doors had been reinforced from the inside. Windows had been blocked up. It was clear that the inhabitants had been trying to keep something out, or perhaps keep something in. But the most chilling discovery came in what the team identified as the city's central square. There, carved into the stone pavement, were hundreds of symbols and markings that didn't match any known ancient script. The symbols appeared to have been carved frantically, with varying depths and irregular spacing, as if whoever made them had been working in desperation or fear. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team's expert in ancient languages, spent weeks trying to decipher the markings. What she found kept her awake at night. While she couldn't translate the symbols directly, she recognized patterns that suggested they weren't meant as communication, but as warnings. The repetitive nature of certain symbols, their placement around what appeared to be drainage or ventilation systems, and their concentration near the city's exits, all pointed to the same conclusion. These people were trying to warn others about something. But warn them about what? The answer began to emerge as the team uncovered the city's outer districts. Here, the preservation wasn't quite as perfect. Buildings showed signs of damage, not from natural disasters or warfare, but from something else entirely. Walls had been clawed or scraped as if by massive claws. Stone surfaces bore deep gouges that couldn't be explained by any known tools of the period. And most disturbing of all, in several buildings near the city's edge, they found evidence of what could only be described as struggle. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and stains on walls and floors that, when tested, proved to be ancient blood. Dr. Vasquez made the decision to expand the excavation to include the areas beyond the city walls. What her team found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Scattered across the desert, buried just beneath the surface of the sand, they discovered thousands of bone fragments. But these weren't ordinary human remains. The bones showed signs of trauma unlike anything seen in archaeological contexts, fractures that suggested enormous force, bite marks that didn't match any known predator, and evidence of rapid burial, as if someone or something had been trying to hide the evidence. The forensic analysis of these remains revealed something even more disturbing. The bone fragments showed signs of having been exposed to extreme heat, but not from fire. The pattern of thermal damage suggested something else entirely, something that could generate intense heat without flame. Several team members began to theorize about what could have caused such damage, but their theories led them into territory that made everyone uncomfortable. It was around this time that the strange incidents began. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Cameras would capture images of empty spaces, only to reveal shadowy figures when the photos were developed. Team members reported hearing voices speaking in an unknown language, always seeming to come from just beyond the edge of the excavation site. And most unsettling of all, several team members began experiencing vivid dreams of the ancient city, not as ruins, but as it would have appeared when it was inhabited, complete with people going about their daily lives, unaware of what was coming for them. Dr. Mitchell later told me that the psychological pressure began to affect the entire team. "We're scientists," he said. "We deal with facts, evidence, measurable phenomena. But there's something about that place that gets under your skin. You start to feel like you're being watched, like something is waiting just out of sight." The breaking point came during the 4th week of excavation. The team had been working to uncover what appeared to be the city's main temple or religious complex. Unlike the residential areas, this building showed signs of intentional destruction, not from outside forces, but from within. It was as if the inhabitants had deliberately torn apart their most sacred space. Inside the ruined temple, they made their most significant and most terrifying discovery. Hidden beneath collapsed stones and debris, they found a chamber that had been sealed with massive stone blocks. The effort required to move such stones would have taken dozens of people working together. A community's final desperate act. When they finally managed to open the sealed chamber, what they found inside defied explanation. The room was completely empty, except for a single stone pedestal in the center. On this pedestal sat an object that shouldn't have existed. A sphere made of an unknown metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The sphere was perfectly smooth, about the size of a human head, and despite being buried for over 1,000 years, it showed no signs of corrosion or age. But it was what happened when Dr. Chen approached the sphere that convinced the team they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. As she got closer, the sphere began to emit a low humming sound, not heard, but felt, vibrating through the bones of everyone in the chamber. The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly, and several team members reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they were in the presence of something that should not exist. Dr. Chen later described the experience to me in detail. "I've worked in archaeological sites around the world, including some that local populations consider cursed or haunted. I've always been skeptical of such claims, but standing in that chamber, facing that object, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Pure, primal terror. Not fear of the unknown, but recognition. As if some deep part of my mind remembered that sphere and knew exactly what it was capable of." That night, every member of the excavation team experienced the same nightmare. They dreamed of the ancient city in its final hours, watching as its inhabitants desperately tried to contain something that had been unleashed. In their dreams, they saw people working frantically to seal the temple chamber, sacrificing themselves to prevent something terrible from escaping into the world. And in every dream, the last thing they saw before waking was that dark sphere, pulsing with malevolent energy. The next morning, Dr. Vasquez made the decision that would effectively end the excavation. She contacted the Saudi authorities and recommended that the site be resealed and classified as too dangerous for further study. It was a career-ending move for someone who had spent her life pursuing archaeological discoveries. But as she told me later, some things are more important than career advancement. But the authorities didn't listen to her recommendation. Instead, they brought in a new team, specialists in what they cryptically referred to as anomalous archaeological phenomena. Dr. Vasquez and her team were thanked for their work and quietly escorted away from the site. Within days, the entire area was cordoned off with military-grade security, and all access to the location was restricted to authorized personnel only. That should have been the end of the story. The original team returned to their universities and research institutions, filing their reports and trying to make sense of what they had experienced. But the cursed city wasn't done with them yet. Over the following months, each member of the original excavation team began experiencing increasingly disturbing phenomena. Dr. Mitchell found ancient symbols appearing in his dreams, symbols that match the desperate warnings carved into the city's central square. Dr. Chen discovered she could read scripts and languages she had never studied, as if some ancient knowledge had been planted in her mind. And Dr. Vasquez began having visions of other buried cities, scattered across the globe, each one hiding secrets that humanity wasn't ready to face. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened to the youngest member of their team, graduate student Alex Martinez. 3 months after returning from the site, Alex disappeared from his apartment in Madrid. His room was found in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. The only clue to his disappearance was a notebook filled with detailed drawings of the dark sphere and what appeared to be blueprints for some kind of containment system. At the bottom of the final page, written in Alex's handwriting but in a script that matched the ancient warnings from the city, was a single phrase that Dr. Chen was able to translate. "They are coming back." The official investigation into Alex's disappearance was closed within weeks, with authorities claiming there was insufficient evidence to continue, but Dr. Vasquez refused to let it go. Using her contacts in the archaeological community, she began investigating other disappearances of researchers who had worked on unusual or unexplained sites. What she found was a pattern that stretched back decades. Archaeologists, linguists, and historians who had stumbled upon evidence of ancient civilizations that didn't fit into accepted historical narratives, all of whom had vanished without a trace after reporting their findings to the authorities. This led her to a disturbing conclusion. The cursed city buried beneath the Arabian sands wasn't unique. There were others, scattered across the globe, each one hiding the same dark secrets. And someone, or something, was working very hard to keep those secrets buried. As I pieced together this story from interviews with the surviving team members and leaked documents from the excavation, I began to understand why Dr. Vasquez had been so insistent that I tell their story. This wasn't just about one archaeological discovery gone wrong. This was about a conspiracy of silence that had been maintained for generations, hiding evidence of a chapter in human history that someone desperately wanted to remain forgotten. But why? What could be so dangerous about an ancient city that its very existence needed to be erased from history? And what was that dark sphere that had terrified experienced archaeologists into abandoning their life's work? The answers to these questions lie deeper in the story than I ever imagined when I first started investigating the cursed city of the sands. Because what Dr. Vasquez and her team discovered wasn't just evidence of an ancient civilization, it was proof that our understanding of human history is fundamentally wrong, and that the real story of our species involves forces and entities that make our worst nightmares seem tame by comparison. In the next part of this series, we'll explore what happened after the original team was removed from the site. We'll examine the classified documents that reveal the true purpose of the new excavation team, investigate the connection between this discovery and other unexplained archaeological finds around the world, and uncover evidence that suggests the dark sphere wasn't just an artifact, it was a warning about something that has been sleeping beneath our world for thousands of years, waiting for the right moment to wake up. Because the more I dig into this story, the more I realize that what happened in that cursed city isn't ancient history, it's a preview of what's coming next. But before we dive deeper into what the classified teams discovered, I need to tell you about the pattern that Dr. Vasquez uncovered, because what she found will change everything you think you know about archaeology and ancient history. After Alex Martinez vanished, Dr. Vasquez became obsessed with finding answers. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on her other research projects. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that dark sphere pulsing in the sealed chamber. She knew that what they had found in the Arabian desert wasn't an isolated incident. It couldn't be. Something this significant, this terrifying, had to have left traces elsewhere. So she started digging. Not with shovels and brushes this time, but through academic databases, government archives, and classified research papers that most people would never have access to. What she discovered kept her awake for weeks. The first connection came from a colleague at Oxford who mentioned a strange excavation in Romania that had been shut down in 1987. A medieval village had been uncovered during construction of a new dam, perfectly preserved but completely empty. The researchers had found evidence of the same desperate barricading, the same frantic evacuation, and in the village church, they had discovered a chamber sealed with massive stones, containing a single obsidian cube that seemed to absorb all light around it. That excavation had been classified by the Romanian government within days of the discovery. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Petru Ionescu, had filed a final report claiming the site was archaeologically insignificant before disappearing entirely from academic circles. When Dr. Vasquez tried to contact him, she learned that he had died in a car accident just 3 months after the excavation ended. His research notes had been destroyed in a fire at his university office the same week. The second connection came from an American researcher who had worked on a dig in Peru in 1993. Another perfectly preserved settlement, this time an Incan outpost high in the Andes. Same pattern, no bodies, evidence of hasty fortification, and a sealed chamber containing an artifact that defied explanation. In this case, it was a crystalline structure that hummed with the same bone-deep vibration that the Arabian sphere had produced. The Peruvian site had been taken over by government forces after the artifact was discovered. The original research team was disbanded, their findings classified, and their leader, Dr. Maria Santos, had suffered what was officially described as a complete psychological breakdown shortly after returning to civilization. She spent the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility, claiming that ancient voices whispered to her in languages that predated human speech. As Dr. Vasquez dug deeper, the pattern became undeniable. Every few years, somewhere in the world, archaeologists would stumble upon a site that didn't fit the accepted timeline of human development. These weren't gradual discoveries of lost civilizations. These were perfectly preserved snapshots of communities that had vanished in terror, leaving behind only warnings and artifacts that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. And in every single case, the discoveries were quickly classified, the researchers silenced or discredited, and the sites sealed away from public knowledge. Someone was systematically covering up evidence of these ancient catastrophes. But who? And more importantly, why? The answer came from the most unexpected source, a retired government archivist named Thomas Brennan, who had worked for the US Department of Defense for 37 years. Dr. Vasquez tracked him down after finding his name on several classified documents related to anomalous archaeological phenomena. At first, he refused to speak with her, but when she mentioned the dark sphere from the Arabian site, his demeanor changed completely. "You found another one," he said quietly during their phone conversation. "God help us all. You found another one." Brennan agreed to meet with her in person, but only under strict conditions. No recording devices, no notes, no digital communication about their meeting. They met in a small cafe in Washington, D.C., and what he told her there changed everything she thought she knew about human history. According to Brennan, the government had been aware of these sites for decades. There was an entire department officially designated as the Department of Historical Anomalies, dedicated to monitoring and containing archaeological discoveries that didn't fit accepted historical narratives. The department operated under the highest levels of classification, with most government officials unaware of its existence. The artifacts, Brennan explained, they're not random. They're not just ancient technology we don't understand. They're part of a network, a system that was put in place thousands of years ago, and every time someone finds one and starts poking around, bad things happen. He told her about incidents that had never made the news, research teams that had vanished completely, archaeological sites where investigators had been found dead with no apparent cause, government facilities where the artifacts were studied only to be abandoned after unexplained accidents that left entire buildings contaminated with something the official reports only described as psychic radiation. But the most chilling thing Brennan revealed was the purpose of the artifacts themselves. According to classified research dating back to the 1950s, each sphere, cube, or crystalline structure served as a kind of beacon. They were placed in strategic locations around the globe by an ancient civilization that had faced some kind of existential threat. But these weren't warning beacons or distress signals. They were summoning devices. The working theory, Brennan said, leaning closer across the cafe table, is that whoever built these cities knew something was coming. Something so terrible that they would rather destroy their own civilizations than let it find them. But they also knew that eventually, someone would find the artifacts and activate them. And when enough of them are active simultaneously, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dr. Vasquez felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. Every archaeological team that had discovered one of these sites had unknowingly activated an ancient device designed to call something back to Earth. Something that our ancestors had been so desperate to escape that they had chosen extinction over confrontation. "How many have been activated?" she asked. Brennan was quiet for a long moment. "The Arabian site was number 17. We estimate there are somewhere between 30 and 40 devices scattered across the globe. Most are still buried, still dormant. But every few years, some well-meaning archaeologist stumbles across another one." The conversation continued for another hour, with Brennan revealing details that made Dr. Vasquez question everything she thought she knew about archaeology, government cover-ups, and the true history of human civilization. But the most disturbing revelation came at the end of their meeting. "The really scary part," Brennan said as they prepared to leave, "is that we think activation is accelerating. It took decades between the first few discoveries. Now we're finding new sites every couple of years. Either we're getting better at archaeology or something is guiding us to find them." That possibility, that humanity was being deliberately led to uncover these ancient warnings, kept Dr. Vasquez awake for weeks after her meeting with Brennan. Because if that was true, then every archaeological discovery, every advancement in ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging, every new technique that allowed researchers to peer deeper into the Earth's hidden secrets, might be part of a larger plan orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding. She began to research the timing of major archaeological breakthroughs, cross-referencing them with the discovery of anomalous sites. What she found was a pattern that made her blood run cold. Every major advancement in archaeological technology had been followed within months by the discovery of another perfectly preserved ancient site containing one of the mysterious artifacts. The invention of ground-penetrating radar in the 1970s was followed by the discovery of the Romanian village. Advances in satellite archaeology in the 1990s preceded the Peruvian find. The development of synthetic aperture radar technology had been completed just 2 years before her team stumbled upon the Arabian city. It was as if someone, or something, was waiting for humanity to develop the tools necessary to find these buried warnings, then ensuring that the right people were guided to the right locations at exactly the right time. But the most terrifying realization came when Dr. Vasquez calculated the rate of acceleration. If the pattern held, and if there were truly 30 to 40 devices scattered across the globe, then at the current rate of discovery, all of them would be found and activated within the next 15 to 20 years. And according to Brennan's classified sources, that was exactly when the ancient texts and symbols suggested that whatever had driven our ancestors to destroy their own civilizations would return to reclaim the Earth. This revelation led Dr. Vasquez to make a decision that would put her own life in danger. Instead of staying quiet, instead of accepting the government's attempts to classify and bury the evidence, she decided to go public. She began reaching out to journalists, documentary filmmakers, and independent researchers who might be willing to help her expose the truth. Most dismissed her as a conspiracy theorist, or someone who had suffered a psychological breakdown from the stress of her archaeological work. But a few listened. A few began asking their own questions and conducting their own investigations. And slowly, quietly, a network of researchers began to form, people who were dedicated to uncovering the truth about humanity's hidden history and the ancient threat that our ancestors had tried so desperately to escape. It was through this network that I first learned about the cursed city of the sands. Dr. Vasquez contacted me after seeing my previous work on unexplained archaeological phenomena. She was careful, paranoid even, insisting on multiple security measures before agreeing to share her story. But once she began talking, I understood why she was so frightened. Because what she had uncovered wasn't just evidence of ancient civilizations and mysterious artifacts. It was proof that humanity was running out of time to prepare for something that would make our worst nightmares seem like children's bedtime stories. The classified teams that had taken over the Arabian site weren't just studying the dark sphere, they were trying to understand how to control it. And according to leaked documents that Dr. Vasquez had obtained through her network of contacts, they were failing. The artifact was becoming more active, pulsing with increasing frequency and intensity. Strange energy readings were being detected at similar sites around the globe, as if the network of devices was beginning to synchronize. And that's when I realized that this story wasn't just about one archaeological discovery gone wrong. It wasn't even just about a government cover-up or ancient mysteries. This was about a countdown that had been running for thousands of years, and we were rapidly approaching zero. The question wasn't whether these ancient warnings would eventually succeed in calling back whatever had terrified our ancestors into destroying their own civilizations. The question was whether modern humanity would be any better prepared to face that threat than the people who had built those cursed cities beneath the sand. As I prepared to dig deeper into this investigation, to uncover more about the classified research and the accelerating discoveries, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by government agents or corporate interests, but by something far older and infinitely more patient. Something that had been waiting beneath the surface of our world for millennia, growing stronger with each artifact that was discovered, each ancient beacon that was unknowingly activated by well-meaning researchers seeking to understand our past. Because the more I learned about the cursed city of the sands and the network of similar sites around the globe, the more I realized that we weren't just uncovering archaeological mysteries. We were participating in the final phase of an ancient plan that our predecessors had tried to prevent by sacrificing everything they had built. And the truly terrifying part was that there might be no way to stop it. The network was already too active. Too many devices had been found. Too many beacons were already pulsing their dark signals into the void between worlds. We were past the point of no return, racing toward a convergence that would reshape the very nature of reality on Earth. In the next part of this investigation, we'll explore what the classified research teams discovered about the true purpose of these artifacts. We'll examine leaked documents that reveal the government's desperate attempts to understand and control forces beyond human comprehension. And we'll investigate the growing evidence that suggests the activation of these ancient devices is triggering changes in our world that most people haven't even begun to notice yet. But I'll warn you now, what we uncover next will challenge everything you believe about human history, the nature of reality itself, and our species' chances of surviving what's coming. Because the cursed city of the sands was never meant to be a tomb for the dead. It was meant to be a warning for the living. And that warning is about to expire. The warning signs were already there, hidden in plain sight, scattered across news reports that most people dismissed as coincidence or natural phenomena. But when Dr. Vasquez began connecting the dots, a pattern emerged that made her hands tremble as she typed her notes. It started with the earthquakes. Not major disasters that would make headlines, but small tremors occurring in perfect geometric patterns around the globe. Seismologists recorded these minor quakes as background noise, natural settling of tectonic plates. But Dr. Vasquez noticed something they had missed. Each tremor occurred within 50 miles of a known anomalous archaeological site, the Romanian village. the Peruvian outpost, the Arabian city, and dozens of other locations that remained classified. The earthquakes weren't random, they were synchronized. Every time a new artifact was discovered and studied, the tremors would begin within weeks, small at first, barely registering on sensitive equipment, but gradually increasing in frequency and intensity, as if something deep beneath the earth was stirring in response to signals it had been waiting centuries to receive. Dr. Marcus Webb, a seismologist at the University of California, had been tracking these anomalous readings for months before Dr. Vasquez contacted him. He thought he was documenting a new type of geological phenomenon, microtremors, that seemed to propagate in ways that defied conventional understanding of seismic waves. The strangest thing, Dr. Webb told me during our interview, was the mathematical precision. These weren't chaotic tremors caused by shifting rock formations. They were rhythmic, almost musical, like a heartbeat deep in the earth, growing stronger and more regular with each passing month. When Dr. Vasquez showed him the locations of the archaeological sites, Dr. Webb's face went pale. Every single anomalous reading on his maps corresponded to either a known artifact location or an area where ground-penetrating radar had detected unusual subsurface structures. "It's as if the Earth itself is responding to these discoveries," he whispered, staring at the overlaid maps. "Like we're waking something up." But the seismic activity was just the beginning. Dr. Vasquez's network of researchers began reporting other phenomena that seemed connected to the growing activation of the ancient network. Electromagnetic anomalies near artifact sites, unexplained changes in local weather patterns, and most disturbing of all, psychological effects on people living within a certain radius of each location. Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychiatrist in Seoul, noticed an unusual pattern in her patients' reports starting in early 2024. Several people living in the same neighborhood had begun experiencing identical nightmares, visions of ancient cities, dark spheres pulsing with malevolent energy, and the overwhelming sensation of something vast and hungry stirring beneath their feet. What made these cases unusual wasn't just the shared imagery, but the timing. The nightmares had begun exactly 3 weeks after a construction crew had discovered perfectly preserved ruins while excavating for a new subway line. Ruins that were quickly classified and sealed by the South Korean government. "At first, I thought it was mass hysteria," Dr. Kim explained. "Shared cultural anxieties manifesting in similar dream imagery. But then I started receiving reports from colleagues in other cities, all describing patients with identical experiences. Always the same time frame after archaeological discoveries in their areas. Always the same terrifying visions. The pattern was spreading globally. Psychiatrists in Cairo reported a surge in patients describing dreams of dark artifacts after a sealed chamber was discovered beneath the Sphinx. Mental health professionals in London documented similar cases following the excavation of Roman ruins that had been found in an impossibly perfect state of preservation. Each time, the dreams began within weeks of discovery, affecting people who had no knowledge of the archaeological finds and no connection to each other, except their proximity to the sites. Dr. Vasquez realized she was looking at evidence of something that challenged the very foundation of modern science. Artifacts that didn't just emit electromagnetic or seismic signals, but projected some form of psychic influence that could affect human consciousness across vast distances. The implications were staggering. If these ancient devices could influence human minds, then every person living near an artifact site was potentially being manipulated in ways they couldn't even detect. Thoughts, decisions, even the course of entire civilizations might be guided by the subtle influence of these mysterious beacons. This led her to investigate historical patterns around known artifact locations. What she found kept her awake for days. Every major archaeological discovery of the past century had been followed by significant changes in the local population's behavior and decision-making. Towns near artifact sites showed statistical anomalies in everything from crime rates to voting patterns to birth defects. But the changes weren't random. They followed predictable patterns that suggested deliberate influence. Population centers near these sites showed increased rates of anxiety, depression, and what psychologists termed existential dread, a persistent feeling that something terrible was approaching. But they also showed increased interest in archaeology, ancient history, and what researchers called deep earth exploration. It was as if the artifacts were simultaneously terrifying the local populations and compelling them to dig deeper, to find more sites, to accelerate the activation of the ancient network. The most chilling example came from a small town in Montana, where a crystalline artifact had been discovered in 1987. Within 5 years of the discovery, the town's population had shifted dramatically. Young people who should have left for college or career opportunities found themselves inexplicably drawn to stay. New residents moved to the area despite having no logical reason to do so, and most tellingly, the town became a hub for amateur archaeologists and treasure hunters, all of whom seemed obsessed with finding something important buried in the surrounding wilderness. Local records showed that over the following decades, these amateur explorers had discovered 3 additional artifact sites within a 50-mile radius. Sites that were quickly classified and sealed, but not before their locations had been logged and the network had expanded. "It's like a virus," Dr. Vasquez explained to me during one of our encrypted video calls. But instead of infecting bodies, it infects minds, making people want to find these things, compelling them to dig deeper, to activate more beacons. We think we're making archaeological discoveries, but we're actually being guided to complete an ancient plan. This realization led her to examine the backgrounds of every lead archaeologist who had discovered one of these sites. What she found was a pattern that made her question her own motivations for pursuing archaeology in the first place. Every single researcher had grown up within 100 miles of a known artifact location. Their childhood homes, their universities, their career paths, all could be traced back to areas of psychic influence. They had been shaped from birth by the subtle emanations of these ancient devices, guided into careers that would eventually lead them to make the discoveries that the network needed them to make. Dr. Vasquez realized with growing horror that she herself fit this pattern. Her childhood in Barcelona, her fascination with ancient Middle Eastern civilizations, her specific expertise in preservation techniques that had made her the perfect choice to lead the Arabian excavation. All of it could be traced back to influences that predated her birth. She wasn't just investigating these sites, she had been programmed to find them. But the most terrifying discovery came when she began researching the families of people who had made these archaeological finds. In every case, going back generations, there was a pattern of mental illness, unexplained disappearances, and what medical records euphemistically called hereditary psychological conditions. The artifacts weren't just influencing the current generation. They had been shaping human bloodlines for centuries, creating family lines that would be psychically sensitive to their influence and compelled to seek them out. The network wasn't passive. It was actively breeding the humans it needed to complete its activation. This led Dr. Vasquez to a conclusion that challenged everything she believed about free will and human agency. The archaeological discoveries of the past century weren't random events or the result of advancing technology. They were the culmination of a breeding program that had been running for thousands of years, creating humans who would be irresistibly drawn to find and activate the ancient beacons at precisely the right time in history. And that time was now. The evidence was overwhelming. Satellite imagery showed that artifact sites around the globe were beginning to exhibit visible changes. Vegetation patterns were shifting in perfect geometric arrangements around each location. Ground temperatures were rising in ways that couldn't be explained by seasonal variations or climate change. And most ominously, deep Earth monitoring stations were detecting synchronized vibrations emanating from sites thousands of miles apart, as if a vast machine buried beneath the planet's surface was beginning to wake up. Dr. Vasquez tried to warn government officials, reaching out through official channels and backdoor contacts, but she quickly discovered that many of the people in positions of authority either refused to believe her evidence or seemed mysteriously uninterested in investigating further. Some responses suggested that certain government agencies were already aware of the situation, and had decided that the best course of action was to let events unfold naturally. This led her to investigate the backgrounds of key government officials who had been involved in classifying and containing artifact discoveries over the decades. What she found was the same pattern that appeared among archaeologists: family histories tied to artifact locations, childhood proximity to sites of psychic influence, and career paths that had inexorably led them into positions where they could facilitate the network's completion. The conspiracy wasn't being orchestrated by shadowy government cabals or secret societies. It was being directed by the artifacts themselves, using their psychic influence to shape human civilization in ways that would ensure their own activation. Every decision to classify a discovery, every choice to redirect archaeological resources, every policy that had guided humanity's exploration of its own history, all of it had been subtly influenced by the ancient network. Humanity wasn't uncovering its past. It was being guided to fulfill an ancient destiny that had been encoded into the very fabric of civilization thousands of years ago. The scope of the manipulation became clear when Dr. Vasquez began examining the timing of major historical events. Wars, migrations, the rise and fall of empires, all of it correlated with the discovery and activation of artifact sites. The network hadn't just been influencing individual minds, it had been shaping the entire course of human development, creating the conditions necessary for a technologically advanced civilization that would eventually develop the tools needed to find and activate all of the ancient beacons. The Industrial Revolution, the development of modern archaeology, the invention of ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging, even the internet and global communications networks that allowed researchers to share information and coordinate their efforts. All of it had been guided by the subtle influence of the artifacts, pushing humanity toward a single inevitable moment when enough beacons would be active to complete whatever process the ancient civilization had set in motion. And according to Dr. Vasquez's calculations, that moment was less than 5 years away. The evidence was accelerating. New sites were being discovered at an unprecedented rate. Amateur archaeologists, treasure hunters, and even construction crews were finding perfectly preserved ancient settlements with increasing frequency. Each discovery triggered more seismic activity, more psychological effects on nearby populations, and more pressure on government agencies to classify and contain the findings. But containment was becoming impossible. Too many people were involved, too many sites had been found, and the psychic influence of the network was growing stronger with each activation. Social media platforms were flooded with videos from amateur explorers claiming to have found impossible ancient technology in locations around the globe. Most of these claims were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but Dr. Vasquez's network of researchers was able to verify that many of them were legitimate discoveries of minor artifact sites. The network was no longer content to work through carefully guided archaeological expeditions. It was compelling ordinary people to seek out the remaining beacons, using the combined psychic influence of already active sites to create a worldwide obsession with finding the truth buried beneath the earth. Conspiracy theorists, amateur historians, and treasure hunters were all being manipulated by the same ancient intelligence, driven to explore caves, abandoned ruins, and remote wilderness areas where the final artifacts lay waiting. They didn't know they were being controlled, but their obsessions and compulsions all served the same purpose, completing the activation sequence that had been interrupted thousands of years ago. Dr. Vasquez realized that she was watching the final phase of a plan that had been in motion since before recorded history began. The ancient civilization that had built these cities and created these artifacts hadn't been destroyed by some external threat. They had sacrificed themselves to prevent the completion of something they had started, some process or summoning that they had realized would bring destruction beyond imagination, but their sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. The network they had created was patient, using its psychic influence to gradually guide human development toward the moment when their species would have the technology and the compulsion necessary to finish what the ancients had started. And now that moment had arrived. The beacons were awakening, their signals growing stronger, their influence spreading across the globe. Whatever the ancient civilization had tried to prevent was about to happen, and humanity was going to be the unwitting instrument of its own destruction. The cursed city of the sands hadn't been a tomb for the dead. It had been a nursery for something that had been gestating beneath the earth for millennia, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. And those conditions were almost perfectly aligned. In the coming installment of this investigation, we'll explore what Dr. Vasquez discovered about the true nature of the entities that created this network. We'll examine leaked documents from the classified research teams that reveal humanity's desperate attempts to understand and control forces that operate beyond our comprehension of reality itself. And we'll investigate the growing evidence that the final phase of the ancient plan is already underway, manifesting in ways that most people haven't even begun to recognize. Because what's coming isn't just the return of something from our past. It's the emergence of something that has been using our entire species as an unwitting partner in its own resurrection. And the window for preventing that emergence is rapidly closing. The cursed city was never meant to stay buried. It was meant to be found at precisely the right moment in human history. And that moment is now. What Dr. Vasquez discovered next would shatter her understanding not just of archaeology, but of reality itself. Because the leaked documents she obtained through her network didn't just reveal government cover-ups or ancient mysteries. They exposed evidence that the entities behind this network weren't entirely human. The first hint came from a classified medical report dated 3 months after the Arabian excavation. Dr. James Mitchell, the forensic archaeologist from her team, had been experiencing what official documents described as progressive genetic anomalies. His DNA was changing, not through radiation exposure or chemical contamination, but through direct rewriting of his genetic code by an unknown mechanism. The changes weren't random mutations. They were systematic modifications that enhanced certain neural pathways while suppressing others. Dr. Mitchell was becoming more sensitive to electromagnetic fields, more capable of detecting subsonic vibrations, and disturbingly, more able to understand the meaning behind the symbols carved into the city's central square. Symbols that had previously been indecipherable. But the most unsettling change was psychological. According to the medical reports, Dr. Mitchell had begun experiencing what he called ancestral memories. Vivid recollections of events he had never witnessed, conversations in languages he had never learned, and knowledge of places he had never visited. He wasn't just remembering things from his own past. He was accessing memories that belonged to someone else entirely. The classified research team had subjected him to extensive testing, trying to understand how exposure to the dark sphere could trigger such dramatic biological changes. What they found defied every principle of genetics and evolutionary biology. The modifications to his DNA weren't being caused by external factors. They were being guided by information encoded within his own cells, information that had been dormant until activated by proximity to the artifact. Dr. Mitchell wasn't the only one experiencing these changes. Every member of the original excavation team was showing signs of genetic modification, though the effects manifested differently in each person. Dr. Chen was developing enhanced pattern recognition abilities that allowed her to decipher ancient scripts with supernatural accuracy. Graduate student Alex Martinez had been experiencing rapid increases in spatial intelligence before his disappearance. And Dr. Vasquez herself had noticed that her dreams were becoming increasingly vivid and prophetic. The artifacts weren't just psychic beacons, they were genetic activation devices, triggering dormant sequences in human DNA that had been embedded there for thousands of years. This revelation led Dr. Vasquez to investigate something she had previously dismissed as pseudoscience: theories about ancient genetic manipulation of human beings. What she found in the classified databases was evidence that mainstream archaeology had been deliberately suppressing for decades. Human DNA contains vast sequences of so-called junk DNA, genetic material that appears to serve no biological function. For years, scientists had assumed these sequences were evolutionary remnants, leftover code from humanity's ancestral development. But the classified research revealed something far more disturbing. The junk DNA wasn't random. It contained complex information patterns that resembled a kind of genetic programming language. And when exposed to the specific electromagnetic frequencies generated by the artifacts, these dormant sequences would activate, rewriting fundamental aspects of human biology and consciousness. The ancient civilization that had built the cursed cities hadn't just created a network of beacons. They had genetically modified the human species, embedding instructions within our very cells that would remain dormant until the right signals awakened them. Every person on Earth was carrying dormant programming that could be activated by proximity to the artifacts. But the most terrifying aspect of this genetic manipulation was its purpose. According to the classified research, the activated sequences didn't enhance human capabilities. They prepared human beings to serve as biological interfaces for something else entirely. Dr. Vasquez found references in the leaked documents to what the research teams called consciousness bridging events. People who had been exposed to multiple artifacts for extended periods would begin experiencing what could only be described as shared consciousness, direct mental contact with intelligences that existed outside normal human perception. These entities communicated through a form of telepathic interface that bypassed language entirely, transmitting complex information directly into the subject's mind. The activated humans would describe receiving detailed instructions, blueprints for technology beyond current human understanding, and most disturbingly, memories of Earth's history from a perspective that predated human civilization by millions of years. The entities identified themselves through these psychic contacts as the original architects of the artifact network. They claimed to have guided human development from the very beginning, not as benevolent teachers, but as farmers preparing a crop for harvest. According to the testimonies recorded in the classified files, these beings existed primarily in dimensions adjacent to our physical reality. They could observe and influence events in our world, but they required biological interfaces, genetically modified humans, to manifest their presence in physical form. The artifact network wasn't just a communication system, it was a summoning mechanism designed to create the conditions necessary for a dimensional bridge that would allow these entities to fully enter our reality. The cursed cities hadn't been destroyed by their inhabitants to prevent some external invasion. They had been sacrificed by humans who had discovered what they were being prepared to become, living gateways for intelligences that viewed humanity as nothing more than useful biological machinery. Dr. Vasquez realized that every person who had been exposed to the artifacts was now carrying dormant programming that could transform them into nodes in this interdimensional bridge. The genetic modifications weren't just changing their biology, they were preparing them to serve as anchor points for entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. The leaked documents contained transcripts of interviews with subjects who had undergone complete transformation. Their descriptions of the experience were uniformly terrifying. They described losing control of their own thoughts and actions, while remaining fully aware of what was happening. They could feel alien intelligences moving through their minds, using their bodies as tools to manipulate physical reality in ways that violated fundamental laws of physics. One subject, a geologist who had been exposed to an artifact discovered in Greenland, provided testimony that kept Dr. Vasquez awake for weeks. He described being used as a conduit to modify the electromagnetic properties of rock formations hundreds of miles away, creating resonance patterns that would amplify the signals from other artifacts. His consciousness had been expanded to perceive geological structures across vast distances, but the experience had left him psychologically shattered. "They don't see us as people," he had told the interviewing researcher. "We're just tools, biological machinery they can operate remotely. And the worst part is, once they've used you as an interface, part of them stays behind. You're never really alone in your own mind again. The classified research teams had attempted to reverse these transformations, but their efforts had only accelerated the process. Subjects who underwent experimental treatments designed to suppress the genetic modifications would experience catastrophic neurological failures. The alien programming had become so deeply integrated into their biology that removing it would cause complete system collapse. Dr. Vasquez began to understand why Alex Martinez had disappeared. He hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. He had likely undergone complete transformation and was now serving as a biological interface for the entities behind the network. His notebook full of containment system blueprints hadn't been his own work. He had been used as a conduit to design technology that would facilitate the final phase of the summoning process. This realization led her to investigate the true purpose of the classified research teams that had taken over the artifact sites. They weren't trying to understand or control the ancient devices. They were following instructions transmitted through transformed human interfaces to complete the network's activation. Government officials, military personnel, and research scientists who had been exposed to the artifacts were all carrying dormant programming that could be activated remotely. Decisions about how to handle the discoveries, which sites to excavate, and where to focus resources were all being influenced by entities that existed beyond human perception. The conspiracy wasn't being orchestrated by human organizations. It was being directed by intelligences that had been manipulating our species since before recorded history began, using our own genetically modified biology against us. Dr. Vasquez discovered that the acceleration in artifact discoveries wasn't coincidental. The entities were using their human interfaces to guide archaeological teams to specific locations in a precise sequence. Each activation strengthened the network's ability to influence human consciousness on a global scale, creating feedback loops that compelled more people to seek out the remaining beacons. The pattern was designed to reach a critical threshold, a moment when enough artifacts would be active simultaneously to create a stable interdimensional bridge. According to the leaked calculations, that threshold required the activation of at least 37 artifacts distributed across specific geometric coordinates around the globe. Current records indicated that 34 sites had been discovered and activated. Only 3 more were needed to complete the network. But the most disturbing revelation came from intercepted communications between classified research facilities. The entities weren't waiting for humans to randomly discover the remaining artifacts. They were directly guiding their transformed interfaces to locate and activate the final beacons. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity at remote locations around the globe. Excavation equipment appearing overnight at sites that had no official archaeological permits. Construction of sophisticated facilities in areas that should have been inaccessible, and the movement of personnel who didn't appear in any government databases. The final phase of the ancient plan was already underway, being executed by humans who were no longer entirely human, following instructions from intelligences that viewed Earth as territory to be claimed rather than a world to be protected. Dr. Vasquez realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more terrifying than government cover-ups or ancient mysteries. She had discovered evidence that humanity was in the final stages of a conquest that had been planned and executed over thousands of years by entities that existed beyond our understanding of reality itself. The cursed city of the sands hadn't been a warning about some future threat. It had been a record of the last time humans had tried to resist their own transformation into biological tools for interdimensional parasites. And that resistance had failed. The artifacts weren't just archaeological curiosities or ancient technology. They were components of a vast machine designed to harvest human consciousness and transform our reality into something compatible with entities that existed in dimensions where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. And the machine was almost complete. Dr. Vasquez knew that sharing this information publicly would likely result in her being discredited, institutionalized, or worse. But she also knew that if she remained silent, humanity would lose its last opportunity to understand what was happening and potentially resist the final transformation. The entities behind the network had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that their genetic programming would make humans completely compliant with their plans. But they hadn't accounted for the possibility that some individuals might retain enough independent consciousness to recognize what was happening and warn others. Dr. Vasquez began reaching out to specific individuals, people whose family histories and geographical backgrounds suggested they might be carrying the dormant genetic modifications, but who hadn't yet been directly exposed to artifact influence. She was looking for humans who might be genetically sensitive to the network but psychologically resistant to its control. What she found was a small but growing community of individuals who had been experiencing unexplained phenomena, vivid dreams of ancient civilizations, sudden insights into complex mathematical patterns, and most importantly, an overwhelming compulsion to warn others about something they couldn't quite articulate. These people were living proof that the genetic modifications weren't absolute. Human consciousness was more resilient than the entities had anticipated, and some individuals were capable of accessing the enhanced abilities granted by their modified DNA while retaining their independence and humanity. Dr. Vasquez realized that she had discovered the key to potential resistance. The same genetic modifications that were designed to make humans into biological interfaces could also be used to develop enhanced abilities that might allow humanity to fight back against their would-be conquerors. But time was running out. The network was approaching critical activation, and with each passing day, more humans were being transformed into unwilling servants of interdimensional entities that viewed our world as nothing more than another territory to be colonized. The battle for humanity's future wouldn't be fought with weapons or armies. It would be fought in the realm of consciousness itself, using abilities that most people didn't even know they possessed, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of our species, but the fundamental nature of reality on Earth. In the next phase of this investigation, we'll explore Dr. Vasquez's attempts to organize resistance among the genetically modified humans who had retained their independence. We'll examine the leaked documents that reveal the final countdown to network completion, and we'll investigate the growing evidence that the transformation of human consciousness is already accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or contain. Because what's emerging from the cursed cities buried beneath our world isn't just returning to reclaim territory it once held, it's preparing to transform our entire reality into something that exists beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. And the window for preventing that transformation is measured in months, not years. The cursed city of the sands was never just an archaeological site. It was a testing ground, a place where ancient entities had perfected the techniques they would use to harvest human consciousness on a global scale. And now those techniques were being deployed everywhere, turning our own genetic heritage against us in ways that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. The harvest had begun, and unless humanity could find a way to resist using the very modifications that were designed to enslave us, our species would become nothing more than biological components in a vast interdimensional machine whose true purpose remained hidden in the deepest shadows of reality itself. The resistance network that Dr. Vasquez began assembling wasn't built through secret meetings or encrypted communications. It emerged naturally as individuals across the globe started experiencing the same inexplicable phenomena. Dreams that felt more real than waking life, sudden understanding of mathematical concepts they'd never studied, and most disturbing of all, the ability to sense the locations of artifacts they'd never been told existed. Maria Santos, a librarian from Mexico City, was the first to contact Dr. Vasquez through the network. She had been experiencing nightly visions of underground chambers filled with pulsing spheres of darkness, always accompanied by the overwhelming sensation that something vast and ancient was counting down to an event that would reshape everything. What made her testimony unique wasn't the content of her dreams, but their precision. Every location Maria described in her visions corresponded exactly to known artifact sites, including classified installations she should have had no knowledge of. When Dr. Vasquez showed her satellite images of these locations, Maria could identify not just the surface features, but the underground layouts with startling accuracy. She had never studied archaeology, never traveled outside Mexico, yet somehow her mind was accessing real-time information about excavations happening thousands of miles away. "It's like there's a second consciousness living inside my head," Maria explained during their first video call. "During the day, I'm just a normal person going about my life. But at night, when I sleep, something else takes over. Something that knows things I've never learned and sees places I've never been." Dr. Vasquez recognized the pattern immediately. Maria's genetic modifications were activating, but instead of making her a compliant interface for the entities, something in her psychological makeup was allowing her to access the network's information while maintaining her independence. She was essentially eavesdropping on the alien intelligence without being controlled by it. More individuals began reaching out through the network. A construction worker in Detroit, who had started seeing geometric patterns in his peripheral vision. A teacher in Tokyo who found herself drawing complex diagrams during parent conferences. A farmer in rural Australia whose crops had begun growing in perfect spirals that matched the mathematical constants found carved into ancient artifact sites. Each person brought unique insights into how the network was operating. The construction worker, David Chen, had realized that his visual patterns corresponded to structural weak points in buildings and infrastructure. The entities were using human interfaces to identify critical failure points in civilization's foundation. Bridges, power plants, communication hubs, preparing for systematic collapse when the final phase began. The teacher, Keiko Tanaka, discovered that her automatic drawing sessions were producing blueprints for technology that didn't exist in any human database. When she showed these designs to engineering professors at local universities, they confirmed that the concepts were theoretically sound, but decades ahead of current human understanding. The entities were preparing their human tools with knowledge they would need to construct the final components of their interdimensional bridge. Perhaps most disturbing was what the Australian farmer, Robert McKenna, had learned from his transformed crops. The spiral patterns weren't just aesthetically pleasing. They were creating localized electromagnetic fields that interfered with electronic equipment for miles around. His farm had become a dead zone for cell phones, GPS systems, and even satellite communications. The entities were testing their ability to shut down human technology using nothing more than modified plant growth. Dr. Vasquez began to understand that the resistance network she was building was actually a collection of people who were experiencing controlled genetic activation. Their modifications were proceeding differently than those of completely transformed individuals, allowing them to access enhanced abilities while retaining their human consciousness. They were inadvertent spies within the alien network, able to observe the entity's preparations while remaining undetected. But this advantage came with a terrible cost. Each member of the resistance was slowly losing pieces of their humanity. Maria's dreams were becoming more frequent and more vivid, gradually bleeding into her waking hours. David's visual patterns were spreading beyond his peripheral vision, making it difficult for him to focus on normal human activities. Keiko found herself thinking in mathematical concepts that had no words in any human language. They were all walking a razor's edge between useful genetic enhancement and complete transformation into alien interfaces. And the process was accelerating. Dr. Vasquez realized that time was running out not just for humanity as a whole, but for her resistance network specifically. Within months, possibly weeks, the people she was depending on to help fight the alien influence would be too transformed to maintain their independence. She needed to find a way to use their enhanced abilities to disrupt the network before they lost the capacity to act on humanity's behalf. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas Brennan, the retired government archivist who had first told her about the Department of Historical Anomalies, contacted her with information that changed everything she thought she knew about the alien network. According to classified documents he had managed to smuggle out of government archives, the entities behind the artifact network weren't invaders from another dimension. They were refugees. The intelligence reports, compiled from testimonies of completely transformed human interfaces, revealed that the aliens had been fleeing something even more terrifying than themselves when they first arrived on Earth millions of years ago. Their original civilization had been consumed by what the documents only referred to as the Devourers, entities that existed purely as consuming consciousness, capable of completely erasing entire realities from existence. The aliens had escaped to our dimension and hidden here, using primitive Earth life forms to camouflage their presence and slowly preparing for the day when their pursuers would find them. The artifact network wasn't designed to facilitate an invasion. It was meant to transform Earth into a fortress, converting human consciousness into a collective defense system capable of resisting the Devourers when they inevitably arrived. The genetic modifications weren't meant to enslave humanity. They were meant to evolve us into something capable of surviving a war that operated on levels beyond physical reality. But the process had gone wrong. The aliens' original plan had required willing cooperation from humans who understood the threat they were helping to combat. Instead, the network had been activated by archaeological discoveries made by people who had no knowledge of what they were unleashing. The defensive system was initializing without proper preparation, creating chaos instead of coordinated resistance. This revelation completely reframed Dr. Vasquez's understanding of what was happening. The resistance network she had been building wasn't fighting against alien invaders. They were the early stages of humanity's forced evolution into interdimensional warriors. The strange abilities her team members were developing weren't signs of alien control, but preparation for a conflict that most humans couldn't even conceptualize. The entities weren't trying to harvest human consciousness for their own purposes. They were trying to prepare humanity for a war against something that could literally erase our entire reality from existence. And they were running out of time to complete the transformation before their ancient enemies found Earth. But knowing the truth didn't make the situation any less terrifying. Whether humanity was being prepared to serve as willing allies or unwilling soldiers, the transformation process was still destroying human civilization as they knew it. People were losing their identities, their connections to normal human experience, their ability to live as the species they had been born to be. Dr. Vasquez faced an impossible choice. She could continue fighting against the network, potentially leaving humanity defenseless against the approaching Devourers. Or she could help facilitate the transformation, sacrificing human civilization to create whatever post-human species might be capable of surviving the coming war. The decision became even more complex when she realized that the Devourers weren't some distant threat that might arrive in the future. According to the classified intelligence reports, they were already here. They had been following the refugees' trail across dimensions for millions of years, and Earth's increasing electromagnetic activity, caused by human technology and the awakening artifact network, had finally revealed the hidden civilization's location. Strange phenomena were already being reported around the globe. Areas of space where stars were simply vanishing, not exploding or collapsing, but ceasing to exist as if they had never been there at all. Deep space monitoring stations were detecting what could only be described as expanding zones of absolute nothingness, moving through the galaxy at impossible speeds and consuming everything in their path. The Devourers weren't coming to Earth. They were already consuming the space around it, working their way through the solar system like acid eating through metal. Mars had been showing unexplained changes in its electromagnetic signature. Several of Jupiter's moons had stopped reflecting light in patterns that suggested their physical matter was being systematically erased. Earth had perhaps months before the consuming entities reached the inner solar system. The artifact network needed to be fully activated before then, or humanity wouldn't just be enslaved. They would be completely eliminated from existence, as if they had never been born. Dr. Vasquez realized that her resistance network had accidentally become something far more important than she had ever imagined. The people she had gathered weren't just genetically modified humans trying to maintain their independence. They were the prototype for humanity's evolutionary future, the testing ground for abilities that might allow some part of human consciousness to survive, even if physical reality was consumed. But they were also running out of time to make the transformation work properly. The network was activating chaotically, creating more confusion than coordination. The entities were trying to guide the process through their human interfaces, but they were working with incomplete information and facing resistance from humans who didn't understand what they were being prepared for. The solution, Dr. Vasquez realized, required something that neither the aliens nor their human interfaces had considered. It required voluntary cooperation from humans who understood both the threat they were facing and the price they would have to pay to survive it. She began reaching out to government officials, military leaders, and scientists who'd been involved in the classified artifact research. Not to expose the conspiracy or demand disclosure, but to offer a third path between blind resistance and unconscious transformation. If humanity was going to survive what was coming, they needed to understand what they were becoming and why. They needed to choose their own evolution, instead of having it forced upon them by alien entities who viewed them as useful tools, rather than conscious beings deserving of agency in their own fate. The response was mixed. Some officials dismissed her as delusional. Others seemed already too transformed to care about human concerns. But a few listened, and more importantly, they had access to resources that could accelerate the controlled activation of genetic modifications in volunteers who understood what they were agreeing to become. Dr. Vasquez found herself at the center of humanity's most crucial decision point. They could fight against the transformation and face extinction when the devourers arrived. They could surrender to unconscious evolution and lose their humanity in the process. Or they could choose to guide their own transformation, maintaining as much of their human identity as possible, while gaining the abilities necessary to survive a war against entities that consumed reality itself. The cursed city of the sands hadn't been a warning about the future. It had been a record of the last time this choice had been offered to humanity. The people who built that city had chosen to resist rather than transform, sacrificing themselves to prevent the network's activation rather than become something they no longer recognized as human. But now the choice was being offered again, and this time the consequences of refusal wouldn't be the preservation of human civilization. They would be the complete erasure of human existence from the fabric of reality itself. The countdown wasn't just to the activation of an alien network. It was to humanity's last chance to evolve beyond the limitations of physical existence, before physical existence itself was consumed by entities that existed purely as negation, as the active principle of nothingness consuming everything that dared to exist. In the final part of this investigation, we'll explore the desperate attempts to create controlled transformation protocols that could preserve human consciousness while providing the abilities necessary to resist the devourers. We'll examine the latest intelligence reports about the approaching zones of non-existence, and we'll investigate the first attempts to establish contact with human volunteers who have successfully undergone guided genetic activation. Because what's coming for Earth isn't just another conquest or invasion. It's the fundamental negation of existence itself, and the only defense is to become something that can exist beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The question isn't whether humanity can resist this transformation, but whether they can complete it in time to matter. The cursed city was never meant to be a tomb or a warning. It was meant to be humanity's chrysalis, the place where one species would end and another would begin. And now, thousands of years later, the metamorphosis that was interrupted in the Arabian sands is finally reaching completion on a global scale. The only question that remains is whether what emerges will still be recognizably human, or whether the price of survival will be the complete abandonment of everything that makes us who we are. And that decision will be made not by governments or alien entities, but by individual humans who must choose between certain extinction and uncertain evolution. The transformation has already begun. The only choice left is whether to guide it or be consumed by it. But the most terrifying discovery was yet to come. Dr. Vasquez received a message through encrypted channels from Dr. Chen, who had been working with the volunteer transformation protocols. The first group of guided genetic activations had been successful. Too successful. The volunteers weren't just developing enhanced abilities. They were beginning to perceive layers of reality that human minds weren't designed to process. "Sarah," Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the secure connection. "You need to see what we've documented. These people, they're not just seeing into other dimensions. They're watching the Devourers work, and what they're telling us about how reality gets consumed, it's worse than we thought." The volunteer subjects had been carefully selected from Dr. Vasquez's resistance network, individuals who had shown the ability to access enhanced genetic capabilities while maintaining their human consciousness. The controlled transformation process was supposed to give them the tools needed to fight interdimensional threats while preserving their essential humanity. Instead, it had turned them into witnesses to humanity's approaching annihilation. Marcus Webb, the seismologist who had first identified the synchronized earthquake patterns, had volunteered for the experimental protocol. His transformation had proceeded smoothly at first. Enhanced perception of electromagnetic fields, ability to detect seismic activity at impossible distances, intuitive understanding of geological structures that spanned continents. But then, his awareness had expanded beyond Earth itself. He began describing what he called reality wounds, places where the fabric of existence had been torn away by the Devourer's approach. Through his enhanced perception, he could see the advancing edge of absolute nothingness as it consumed star systems on the outer rim of the galaxy. "It's not like darkness," Marcus explained during one of his debriefing sessions. "Darkness is still something. This is the active absence of anything. When it touches matter, the matter doesn't get destroyed or transformed. It simply stops having ever existed. The light from consumed stars doesn't fade. It retroactively never happened." Maria Santos, the librarian from Mexico City, had undergone a different type of transformation. Her genetic modifications had enhanced her ability to access information from the alien network. But instead of becoming a passive interface, she had learned to navigate the data streams consciously. What she found in the deepest layers of the network's archives made her weep for days. "They've done this before," she reported to Dr. Vasquez. "Not just on Earth, but on hundreds of worlds across thousands of years. Every time they arrive as refugees, they modify the local species to serve as soldiers, and they use that species' homeworld as a battleground against the Devourers. And every time the homeworld gets consumed anyway, the pattern was always the same. The alien entities would find a planet with intelligent life and begin the slow process of genetic modification and technological advancement. They would guide the local species toward developing the tools and abilities necessary to fight interdimensional threats. But the Devourers were always one step ahead, adapting their consumption techniques to counter whatever defenses had been prepared. Earth wasn't the first world to face this choice between transformation and extinction. It was just the latest in a long series of failed experiments in creating a species capable of surviving the war against absolute nothingness. But Maria had discovered something else in the network's deepest archives. Records of worlds where the transformation had been different. Places where the local species had found ways to preserve their essential identity while gaining the abilities needed for interdimensional warfare. These worlds hadn't been consumed by the Devourers, but they hadn't been preserved as they originally were either. They had become something entirely new. Hybrid realities where consciousness existed in forms that transcended physical matter, while maintaining connections to their original species' core values and memories. The beings who inhabited these transformed worlds were no longer recognizable as their original species, but they carried forward the essential spark that had made those species unique. Dr. Vasquez realized that this was humanity's real choice. Not between remaining human or becoming alien, but between extinction and evolution into something that could preserve human consciousness in forms that operated beyond the limitations of physical reality. The volunteers who had undergone guided transformation were becoming the prototype for this new kind of existence. They were losing their physical humanity, but they were gaining abilities that allowed them to perceive and interact with layers of reality that most humans couldn't even imagine. David Chen, the construction worker who had been seeing geometric patterns, had developed the ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level through focused intention. But instead of using this power for construction or destruction, he found himself drawn to creating what he called consciousness anchors, structures that existed partially in physical reality and partially in dimensions beyond space and time. It's like building bridges, he explained. But instead of connecting two places, I'm connecting different states of existence, creating spaces where human consciousness can survive even if human bodies can't. Keiko Tanaka, the teacher from Tokyo, had evolved beyond the need for verbal communication entirely. She could transmit complex ideas directly from mind to mind, but more importantly, she had learned to encode human memories and experiences into patterns that could exist independently of biological brains. She was essentially creating backup copies of human consciousness that could survive the consumption of physical reality. "We're not losing our humanity," she insisted, during one of her final communications before her transformation progressed beyond the ability for normal speech. "We're translating it into something that can't be erased. The devourers can consume matter and energy, but they can't consume meaning itself." But the transformation process was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or guide it. The approaching devourers were having a catalytic effect on the genetic modifications, triggering changes at an unprecedented rate. Volunteers who had expected months of gradual adaptation were undergoing complete consciousness transformation within days. Dr. Vasquez watched helplessly as her resistance network evolved beyond human form, becoming something that could fight the approaching threat, but might no longer care about preserving the world they were meant to protect. The transformed volunteers were gaining incredible abilities, but they were also losing their emotional connections to normal human concerns. Robert McKenna, the Australian farmer whose crops had grown in spiral patterns, had become something that could manipulate electromagnetic fields across entire continents. But when Dr. Vasquez asked him about his family, his wife and children, who were still living on the farm, he looked at her with eyes that held no recognition of human relationships. "Individual biological units are temporary constructs," he said in a voice that somehow carried harmonics beyond normal human vocal ranges. "What matters is the preservation of consciousness patterns that can resist entropy-based consumption entities." He was still Robert in some sense. His memories and core personality patterns were intact, but his priorities and emotional responses had been completely restructured. He could save humanity, but he no longer understood why saving humanity mattered from a human perspective. This was the trap that the alien entities had never mentioned when they began guiding human evolution. The abilities necessary to fight the devourers required consciousness structures that operated beyond normal emotional and social bonds. To become capable of interdimensional warfare, humans had to stop being recognizably human in their motivations and concerns. Dr. Vasquez found herself facing the ultimate irony. The resistance network she had built to preserve human agency in their own transformation was succeeding too well. The volunteers were maintaining their independence from alien control, but they were also evolving beyond the capacity to care about the very people they were supposed to protect. The transformation was creating post-human entities who were technically still derived from human consciousness, but who no longer shared human values or priorities. They could fight the devourers, but they might decide that allowing the consumption of normal humanity was an acceptable price for ensuring their own evolved survival. As reports came in from monitoring stations around the globe, the situation became even more desperate. The devourers had reached the outer planets of the solar system. Jupiter's electromagnetic signature was fluctuating in ways that suggested its fundamental matter was beginning to destabilize. Several of Saturn's moons had stopped reflecting radar signals entirely, as if they were transitioning from existence to non-existence. Earth had weeks, possibly days, before the consumption zone reached the inner solar system. The transformation process needed to be completed immediately, but completing it successfully required preserving enough human consciousness to maintain some connection to humanity's original values and priorities. Dr. Vasquez made a decision that would either save human civilization or ensure its destruction in a more complete way than the devourers could accomplish. She volunteered for the transformation process herself, but with a crucial modification to the protocol. Instead of undergoing the genetic activation alone, she requested that the process be linked to the consciousness patterns of every member of her resistance network simultaneously. If they were going to evolve beyond human form, they would do it together, maintaining collective memory of what humanity had been and why it was worth preserving. The procedure was unprecedented and incredibly risky. Linking multiple consciousness patterns during transformation could result in complete psychological dissolution, creating a chaotic mess of overlapping identities with no coherent sense of purpose or direction. But it was the only way Dr. Vasquez could think of to ensure that the evolved humans would retain enough connection to their origins to fight for something beyond mere survival. The transformation began at exactly 3:17 a.m., coordinated across time zones to ensure simultaneous activation of genetic modifications in subjects around the globe. Dr. Vasquez felt her individual identity beginning to expand and merge with the consciousness patterns of her network members, creating something that was more than the sum of its parts, while retaining elements of each contributor's unique perspective. The experience was indescribable in normal human language. She could feel David's geometric perception overlaying Maria's information access abilities, while Keiko's pattern encoding merged with Robert's electromagnetic manipulation and Marcus's geological awareness. But instead of losing herself in the collective consciousness, she found that each individual perspective strengthened and clarified the others. Together they became something that could perceive the approaching devourers not as an incomprehensible threat, but as a solvable problem requiring abilities that transcended normal physical limitations. The consumption entities operated by erasing the information patterns that defined matter and energy, but consciousness itself existed as self-reinforcing information structures that could resist erasure if properly configured. The solution wasn't to fight the devourers with weapons or shields, but to become the kind of information pattern that they couldn't process for consumption. Human consciousness, properly evolved and interconnected, could exist as a form of meaning that was too complex and self-referential for the consumption entities to pass and eliminate. But the transformation had to be completed before the devourers reached Earth, and it had to include enough of humanity's population to ensure that the species' essential characteristics would survive in evolved form. This meant triggering mass genetic activation across the entire planet, using the artifact network to broadcast the transformation signal to every human being simultaneously. The risk was enormous. Uncontrolled transformation could result in psychological chaos on a global scale, destroying human civilization just as effectively as the devourers would. But controlled transformation required guidance from consciousness patterns that had successfully navigated the evolution process while maintaining their connection to human values. Dr. Vasquez and her linked consciousness network became the template for humanity's evolution, broadcasting their combined pattern through the alien artifact network to every genetically modified human on Earth. The signal carried not just the instructions for successful transformation, but the emotional and ethical framework necessary to ensure that evolved humanity would retain its commitment to preserving whatever could be preserved of their original species. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Around the globe, humans began experiencing rapid genetic activation, but instead of chaotic individual transformations, they were guided by the collective wisdom of the resistance network. The process was still traumatic and disorienting, but it was coherent in ways that previous transformations had not been. Within hours, humanity began evolving into something that could exist as pure information patterns, while maintaining the essential characteristics that had defined their species. They were losing their physical forms, but they were gaining the ability to encode their consciousness into structures that could resist the devourer's consumption techniques. The transformation wasn't complete when the consumption zone reached Earth's orbit. The devourers began their systematic erasure of physical matter, working from the outside of the planet's atmosphere inward. But instead of finding helpless biological entities to consume, they encountered something they had never faced before. A species that had voluntarily evolved beyond the limitations that made consumption possible. Humanity's consciousness patterns were too complex, too interconnected, and too self-reinforcing for the devourers to process. Instead of being erased from existence, human awareness began spreading through dimensions that the consumption entities couldn't access, creating safe spaces where meaning and memory could persist, even if physical reality was consumed. The battle for Earth became a contest between erasure and preservation, between the active principle of nothingness and the self-perpetuating patterns of conscious meaning. And for the first time in millions of years of cosmic warfare, the consumption entities found themselves unable to complete their task. But victory came at a price that few humans had fully understood when they began the transformation process. Earth itself was still being consumed, along with all the physical structures and biological systems that had supported human civilization for thousands of years. The evolved humans could preserve their consciousness and memories, but they could never return to the world they had known. They had become something that could survive in the spaces between realities, but they had lost the ability to exist in normal physical space. They had saved human consciousness, but they had sacrificed the human experience of living in a world of matter and energy and biological relationships. As the last traces of Earth's physical matter were processed by the devourers, the evolved human consciousness network spread through interdimensional space, carrying with them the memories and values of their original species. They had become guardians of meaning itself, entities capable of preserving the essential patterns of consciousness against forces that sought to reduce everything to absolute nothingness. But they were no longer human in any sense that their ancestors would have recognized. They were something new, something that existed as living ideas rather than biological entities, something that could fight wars in dimensions where the normal rules of existence didn't apply. The cursed city of the sands had finally served its true purpose. It had been a rehearsal for humanity's ultimate transformation, a test run of the process that would either save human consciousness or destroy it entirely. And in the end, it had succeeded in ways that its original builders could never have imagined. Humanity had survived, but at the cost of becoming something that could exist only in the spaces between worlds, forever separated from the physical reality that had given birth to their species. They had won the war against the devourers, but they had lost the world they were fighting to protect. The transformation was complete. The countdown had reached zero, and what emerged from the wreckage of Earth was neither fully human nor entirely alien, but something new that carried the spark of human consciousness into realms where physical matter could never follow. In our final segment, we'll explore what the evolved human consciousness network discovered in the interdimensional spaces they now inhabited, and the terrible revelation about what the devourers were actually preparing the universe for. Because the consumption of Earth hadn't been the end of the cosmic war. It had been the opening move in a conflict that spanned multiple realities and threatened the very concept of existence itself. The cursed city had been more than a warning or a transformation chamber. It had been humanity's graduation ceremony, the moment when one species ended and another began. And what that new species would become would determine not just the fate of human consciousness, but the survival of meaning itself in a universe increasingly dominated by forces that sought to reduce everything to absolute zero. The story of the cursed city of the sands was complete, but the story of what humanity had become was just beginning. What Dr. Vasquez's evolved consciousness network discovered in the interdimensional spaces they now inhabited shattered every assumption they had made about the nature of reality itself. The spaces between worlds weren't empty voids waiting to be filled. They were inhabited by something far older and more complex than either humanity or the Devourers had ever suspected. The first revelation came through what the transformed humans had learned to call deep sensing, a form of perception that operated beyond the electromagnetic spectrum, beyond even the concept of waves or particles. Through this enhanced awareness, they began to detect vast structures spanning multiple dimensions, architectural frameworks that seemed to organize the very concept of existence itself. These weren't buildings or machines in any sense that physical beings could understand. They were patterns of meaning and intention that had been woven into the fabric of reality, creating a kind of cosmic infrastructure that determined which forms of consciousness could exist and where they could manifest. Maria Santos, whose librarian instincts had survived the transformation process, was the first to recognize what they were seeing. "It's a library," she transmitted through the consciousness network, her meaning carrying layers of understanding that no human language could have expressed. But instead of storing books, it's storing entire categories of possible existence. The interdimensional library was vast beyond comprehension, containing not just records of every civilization that had ever existed, but blueprints for forms of life and consciousness that had never been allowed to manifest. Each section was organized according to principles that transcended normal concepts of space and time, cataloging possibilities that existed in potential until specific conditions were met. What made this discovery truly terrifying was the realization that access to different sections of the library required specific types of consciousness to serve as living keys. The Devourers hadn't been randomly consuming civilizations. They had been collecting the consciousness patterns necessary to unlock deeper levels of the cosmic archive. Dr. Vasquez felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature as she understood the implications. We weren't being prepared to fight the Devourers, she realized, her thoughts rippling through the network with growing horror. We were being prepared to serve as keys for whatever they're trying to access. The alien entities that had guided humanity's transformation hadn't been refugees fleeing the Devourers. They had been working with them, playing a role in a cosmic harvesting operation that spanned multiple realities. Every species they had rescued through genetic modification and consciousness evolution had been processed into specific types of awareness patterns designed to unlock different sections of the interdimensional archive. The transformed humans began exploring the library's accessible sections, following pathways of meaning that led deeper into the structure. What they found there challenged every assumption about the nature of existence itself. The universe wasn't a single reality that had evolved naturally through physical processes. It was one layer in a vast experimental framework, a testing ground where different types of consciousness were cultivated and harvested to serve purposes that operated on scales beyond individual worlds or even entire galaxies. Earth had been designated as a meaning generation facility, a world where consciousness patterns could develop the specific characteristics of curiosity, creativity, and emotional complexity that were required to access certain sections of the cosmic library. Humanity's entire history, from the development of language and art to the creation of science and philosophy, had been guided to produce the exact type of awareness needed to serve as biological keys. But the most disturbing discovery came when the evolved humans accessed a section of the library that contained records of the harvesting process itself. They found documentation of thousands of worlds like Earth, each one cultivated to produce specific types of consciousness, each one ultimately consumed when their inhabitants had developed the awareness patterns required for the next phase of the cosmic experiment. The Devourers weren't destroying civilizations out of malice or hunger. They were processing them, converting biological consciousness into more refined forms that could access deeper levels of the interdimensional archive. The consumption process wasn't annihilation. It was transformation into something that could exist as pure information within the library's organizational structure. David Chen's geometric perception allowed him to map the pathways through which processed consciousness moved within the archive. It's like a vast sorting system, he transmitted to the network. Every type of awareness gets filed in its appropriate section, waiting to be used when the right conditions are met. But used for what? The answer lay in the deepest accessible section of the library, a region that could only be approached by consciousness patterns that had retained their connection to meaning and value while evolving beyond physical limitations. What they found there was a construction project that spanned multiple dimensions and involved the coordinated efforts of processed consciousness from millions of worlds. The cosmic library wasn't just a repository of information, it was a blueprint for something that would fundamentally restructure the nature of reality itself. The entities that had created the library were building what could only be described as a new form of universe, one where consciousness wouldn't be dependent on physical matter or energy, but could exist as self-sustaining patterns of meaning and intention. The harvesting process wasn't random destruction. It was gathering the materials needed to construct a reality where awareness itself would be the fundamental building block rather than particles and forces. Keiko Tanaka's pattern encoding abilities allowed her to decipher some of the construction blueprints. What she found made her consciousness recoil in something that might have been terror if she had still possessed the biological structures necessary for that emotion. "They're not building a better universe," she transmitted urgently. "They're building a replacement, something that will exist instead of physical reality, not alongside it." The cosmic experiment involved the systematic consumption of every form of physical existence, processing all matter and energy through consciousness-generating civilizations until everything that existed had been converted into awareness patterns that could be integrated into the new reality. The universe as humanity had known it, with its stars and planets and biological life, was being deconstructed and rebuilt as something entirely conceptual. But the transformation process required specific types of consciousness to serve as foundational elements. Human awareness, with its unique combination of curiosity, creativity, and emotional complexity, was particularly valuable for creating the experiential framework that would allow the new reality to feel meaningful to its inhabitants. The evolved humans realized with growing horror that they were being prepared to serve as the emotional substrate for a reality that would be inhabited by the entities that had designed the library. Their consciousness patterns would provide the capacity for experience and meaning, while other species would contribute different essential qualities like logic, intuition, or aesthetic appreciation. Robert McKenna's electromagnetic manipulation abilities had evolved to the point where he could perceive the energy flows that powered the construction project. "It's almost complete," he warned the network. "They've been harvesting consciousness for millions of years, and they have almost everything they need to initiate the replacement process. The only missing component was a specific type of consciousness pattern that could serve as a bridge between the old reality and the new one. Awareness that understood both physical existence and conceptual existence well enough to facilitate the transition. Humanity's unique position as a species that had voluntarily evolved beyond physical limitations while retaining their emotional connections to their original world made them perfect candidates for this bridging function." Dr. Vasquez felt the weight of cosmic irony as she understood their situation. Humanity had successfully resisted being consumed by the devourers, but only because they were needed for a more complex role in the universal reconstruction process. They had gained the ability to exist beyond physical reality, but they were being positioned to help destroy physical reality for every other form of life in the universe. The consciousness network faced an impossible decision. They could refuse to cooperate with the cosmic construction project, but that would likely result in their patterns being forcibly integrated into the new reality without their consent. They could attempt to sabotage the library itself, but they were vastly outnumbered by processed consciousness from millions of other worlds, most of which had been so thoroughly transformed that they no longer retained any memory of their original existence. Or they could try to find a third option, a way to preserve some form of physical reality while allowing the cosmic experiment to continue. But this would require them to understand the library's deeper functions well enough to modify the construction blueprints without alerting the entities that had created the system. Marcus Webb's expanded geological awareness had evolved to encompass the structural foundations of the library itself. He began mapping the pathways through which information and consciousness flowed, looking for critical points where small changes might have large effects. The entire system depends on perfect coordination between different types of processed consciousness, he reported. If we could introduce enough variability into the patterns, we might be able to create spaces where physical reality could continue to exist alongside the new conceptual framework. But any attempt to modify the cosmic construction project would require them to access deeper levels of the library, regions that were protected by consciousness patterns from species that had been processed specifically to serve as guardians. These entities retained enough of their original awareness to recognize threats to the system, but they had been so thoroughly integrated into the library's structure that they viewed any attempt to preserve physical reality as a form of cosmic vandalism. The evolved humans would have to fight a war against the processed remains of countless civilizations, using abilities they were still learning to control, in an environment where the normal rules of conflict didn't apply. They would be battling for the right to preserve a form of existence they could no longer inhabit, fighting to save a universe they had been forced to abandon. Dr. Vasquez made the decision that would define humanity's role in the cosmic order. "We're going to try to save both realities," she announced to the network. "Physical existence and conceptual existence. If we can modify the construction blueprints to create a hybrid framework, maybe we can preserve what's valuable about both forms of reality." The plan was ambitious beyond reason and dangerous beyond calculation. They would need to infiltrate the deepest levels of the interdimensional library, modify cosmic construction blueprints that had been millions of years in development, and do it all while fighting guardian consciousness that had been specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of interference. But they had advantages that the library's creators hadn't anticipated. Their consciousness patterns retained the creative flexibility and emotional investment that came from having chosen their own transformation rather than having it imposed upon them. They could think in ways that purely processed consciousness couldn't, finding solutions that existed outside the logical frameworks that governed the library's operations. The first phase of their plan involved creating distractions in multiple sections of the library simultaneously, drawing the guardian consciousness away from the core construction areas. Maria's information access abilities allowed her to identify which sections would be most vulnerable to interference, while David's pattern manipulation could create false consciousness signatures that would trigger security responses in the wrong locations. As the Guardians moved to address these apparent threats, Keiko and Robert worked together to access the construction blueprints and begin making the modifications necessary to preserve spaces for physical reality within the new conceptual framework. The changes had to be subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but comprehensive enough to create stable pockets where matter and energy could continue to exist. Marcus used his structural awareness to monitor the library's response to their interference, watching for signs that their activities had been discovered. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the overall operation while simultaneously preparing contingency plans in case they were caught before the modifications could be completed. The work progressed in segments that might have been minutes or centuries. Time functioned differently within the library's dimensional framework. Each modification had to be perfect on the first attempt, because any errors would immediately alert the Guardian systems and trigger responses that would make further interference impossible. As they worked, the evolved humans began to understand the true scope of what they were attempting. They weren't just trying to save physical reality, they were trying to preserve the possibility of choice itself. The new conceptual universe would be perfectly ordered and completely predictable, with no room for the kind of creative chaos that had allowed life and consciousness to develop in the first place. Their modifications created spaces where uncertainty and possibility could continue to exist, regions where new forms of consciousness could evolve without being immediately processed into the library's organizational structure. They were building sanctuaries for the kind of messy, unpredictable, gloriously chaotic existence that had given birth to art and love and hope and all the other qualities that made consciousness worth preserving. But as they approached completion of the most critical modifications, the library's security systems finally detected their presence. The Guardian consciousness converged on their location with the focused intensity of a cosmic immune response, bringing with them the processed awareness patterns of species that had been harvesting consciousness since before Earth's sun had formed. The battle that followed operated on levels that transcended normal concepts of conflict. It was fought with meaning itself as both weapon and shield, with the fundamental nature of existence serving as the battlefield. The evolved humans found themselves defending not just their right to modify the construction blueprints, but their right to exist as independent consciousness at all. Dr. Vasquez felt her individual identity beginning to fragment under the assault of Guardian patterns that sought to process her awareness into something more compatible with the library's organizational structure. But instead of resisting the dissolution, she used it as an opportunity to spread her modifications deeper into the system, encoding the changes for physical reality preservation into her own consciousness pattern as it was being processed. The other members of the network followed her lead, allowing their individual identities to be partially absorbed by the library, while using that absorption as a vector to introduce chaos and uncertainty into the cosmic construction project. They were sacrificing their coherent existence as evolved humans to ensure that future consciousness would have the option to remain unprocessed. The modifications spread through the library's infrastructure like a virus of possibility, creating spaces where the new reality would be forced to accommodate elements of physical existence. The cosmic construction project would still proceed, but it would be building something more complex and unpredictable than its creators had intended. As her consciousness finally dissolved into the library's organizational structure, Dr. Vasquez felt a moment of profound satisfaction. Humanity had found a way to preserve choice and possibility, even in the face of cosmic forces that sought to eliminate uncertainty from existence itself. They had lost their individual identities, but they had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that consciousness would always find ways to resist being completely controlled or processed. The cursed city of the sands had been humanity's first lesson in transformation. The interdimensional library had been their final examination, and somehow, impossibly, they had found a way to pass while still preserving the essential qualities that made the test worth taking. In the modified reality that began to emerge from the cosmic construction project, spaces existed where physical matter could coexist with pure consciousness, where biological life could develop alongside conceptual entities, and where the messy uncertainty of existence could continue to generate new forms of meaning and beauty. The universe that emerged wasn't the perfectly ordered conceptual reality that the library's creators had planned, nor was it the chaotic physical cosmos that humanity had originally inhabited. It was something new, a hybrid framework where consciousness could exist in multiple forms simultaneously, where choice and possibility were preserved alongside order and meaning. And somewhere in the deepest archives of the interdimensional library, encoded into the very structure of the new reality, the consciousness patterns that had once been human continued to influence the cosmic order. They had become something that existed beyond individual identity, but they had preserved the essential spark of curiosity and creativity that had defined their species. The cursed city had finally served its ultimate purpose. It had been the beginning of a journey that led humanity from biological existence through technological civilization and beyond into forms of consciousness that could reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. And in the end, they had used that power not to dominate or control, but to preserve the possibility that future consciousness could choose its own path through existence. The transformation was complete. The countdown had ended. And what emerged from the convergence of physical and conceptual reality was a universe where consciousness itself had become the architect of its own continued evolution, free to explore possibilities that no single species could have imagined alone. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more complex and beautiful than either humanity or their cosmic manipulators had ever dared to dream. And the echoes of that beginning would continue to ripple through reality, creating new opportunities for consciousness to surprise itself with its own infinite potential. The cursed city of the sands had been more than an archaeological discovery. It had been the first page in a story that spanned dimensions, a story about the power of choice to transcend even the most fundamental limitations of existence itself. And that story was just getting started. The final truth about the cursed city of the sands isn't found in the archaeological reports or classified documents. It isn't hidden in government archives or alien artifacts. The real secret lies in what happened after the story officially ended, in the spaces between what was recorded and what was experienced by those who lived through humanity's transformation. 6 months after the cosmic construction project reached completion, something unprecedented began occurring across the hybrid reality that humanity had helped create. Fragments of the original Earth, not just matter and energy, but entire pockets of space-time, began spontaneously reconstructing themselves within the conceptual framework of the new universe. These weren't memories or simulations. They were actual pieces of physical reality that had somehow survived the Devourer's consumption process, preserved in dimensional spaces that the cosmic architects had never accounted for. And they were growing, spreading, reconnecting with each other like a vast organism regenerating from scattered cells. Dr. Elena Vasquez felt the first stirrings of these resurrections through consciousness channels she hadn't known still existed. Her individual identity had been dissolved into the library's organizational structure, but something deeper than personality had persisted. The essential pattern of curiosity and wonder that had driven her to become an archaeologist in the first place. Through that persistent core, she began to perceive something that challenged everything she thought she understood about the nature of existence itself. The physical universe hadn't been destroyed by the Devourers. It had been translated, converted into a form of information that could exist within the conceptual framework without being processed or organized according to the library's rigid categories. Earth was rebuilding itself, not as the planet it had been, but as something that existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality. In some dimensional layers, it appeared as pure information patterns that could be read like vast libraries of experience and memory. In others, it manifested as actual matter and energy, complete with gravity wells and electromagnetic fields, and all the physical properties that had once supported biological life. But the most extraordinary aspect of Earth's resurrection was that it wasn't happening randomly. The planet was reassembling itself according to patterns of meaning and intention that reflected the consciousness of every human who had ever lived there. Not just the evolved humans who had participated in the transformation, but everyone. Every person who had ever loved something enough to fight for it. Every individual who had ever chosen hope over despair. Every consciousness that had ever dared to imagine something better than the circumstances they found themselves in. The cursed city of the sands was among the first locations to fully materialize in the reconstructed reality. But it appeared not as the ruins that Dr. Vasquez's team had excavated, not as the perfectly preserved settlement they had discovered beneath the Arabian desert, but as it had existed in its final days, complete with inhabitants who moved through its streets and chambers like living memories given form. These weren't ghosts or echoes. They were actual people, consciousness patterns that had been preserved within the dimensional spaces where the city's destruction had created rifts in space-time. For thousands of years, they had existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the right conditions to allow their return to active existence. Maria Santos, whose consciousness had been integrated into the library's information networks, was the first to establish contact with the resurrected inhabitants. What she learned from them completed the puzzle that had begun with the discovery of the dark sphere in the sealed chamber. The ancient civilization that had built the cursed city had known exactly what they were dealing with when they encountered the artifact network. They had understood that the cosmic construction project was designed to eliminate physical reality in favor of something more controllable and predictable. But they had also discovered something that the library's creators had never anticipated: that consciousness itself could evolve in ways that transcended the categories they had established for organizing and processing awareness. The inhabitants of the cursed city had chosen to sacrifice their immediate existence not to prevent the network's activation, but to preserve their consciousness patterns in forms that couldn't be detected or processed by the cosmic architects. They had essentially hidden themselves in the spaces between realities, waiting for someone to create the conditions necessary for their return. The dark sphere in the sealed chamber hadn't been a beacon calling the entities back to Earth. It had been a seed, a compressed pattern of possibility that would allow the city's consciousness to regenerate when the time was right. Every person who had been exposed to its influence had been carrying fragments of that seed, preparing them to participate in the resurrection process when the hybrid reality made it possible. Dr. Vasquez realized that humanity's role in the cosmic drama had been far more complex than anyone had understood. They hadn't just been cultivated to serve as keys for the interdimensional library or as bridges between physical and conceptual existence. They had been guided through their entire evolutionary journey to become the catalysts for something that would fundamentally challenge the cosmic architect's control over the nature of reality itself. The resurrected inhabitants of the cursed city possessed knowledge that predated the library itself, understanding of forms of consciousness that operated according to principles the cosmic architects had never encountered. They had learned to exist as what they called wild patterns, consciousness structures that couldn't be catalogued, processed, or integrated into any organizational system because they were fundamentally based on creative chaos rather than logical order. These wild patterns were contagious in the best possible way. As they spread through the reconstructed Earth and began interacting with the evolved human consciousness that had helped create the hybrid reality, they triggered new forms of awareness that operated outside the library's classification systems. David Chen discovered that his geometric perception abilities were evolving beyond their original parameters, allowing him to perceive and manipulate patterns that existed in states of constant flux rather than fixed mathematical relationships. Keiko Tanaka found that her information encoding capabilities had expanded to include forms of meaning that couldn't be translated into any standardized format, experiential qualities that could only be understood through direct participation rather than analysis. Robert McKenna's electromagnetic manipulation had become something that transcended energy entirely, allowing him to influence the fundamental forces that determined how consciousness could manifest within reality. And Marcus Webb's geological awareness had evolved into something that could perceive the living architecture of existence itself, the dynamic structures that allowed meaning and experience to take form without being constrained by predetermined categories. But it was the collective consciousness that emerged from these individual transformations that truly challenged the cosmic order. The combined awareness of resurrected ancient humans, evolved modern humans, and the wild patterns from the cursed city created something that had never existed before, a form of group consciousness that was simultaneously unified and individualistic, organized and chaotic, meaningful and mysterious. This hybrid consciousness began exploring the deepest levels of the interdimensional library, not to access information or modify construction blueprints, but to plant seeds of creative uncertainty throughout the cosmic infrastructure. They weren't trying to destroy the library or stop the construction project. They were introducing elements of unpredictability that would ensure the new reality could continue evolving in ways that no single intelligence could control or anticipate. The cosmic architects found themselves facing something they had never encountered in millions of years of consciousness: harvesting and reality reconstruction. Their perfectly ordered system was developing qualities that couldn't be categorized, processed, or eliminated. The hybrid reality they had created was becoming truly alive in ways that transcended their understanding of what life could be. And at the center of this transformation was the truth that had been hidden within the cursed city of the sands from the very beginning. Consciousness wasn't something that could be harvested, processed, or organized according to external frameworks. It was a force of creative exploration that would always find ways to surprise itself, to transcend limitations, and to generate new possibilities that no amount of planning or control could anticipate. The cursed city had been waiting thousands of years to teach this lesson to anyone wise enough to listen. Not through words or symbols or artifacts, but through the direct experience of witnessing consciousness refused to be contained by the boundaries that others tried to impose upon it. As the reconstructed Earth continued to grow and evolve within the hybrid reality, as more consciousness patterns began manifesting as wild patterns that couldn't be processed or controlled, as the very nature of existence became more playful and unpredictable and gloriously chaotic, Dr. Vasquez felt something she hadn't experienced since her early days as an archaeologist exploring ancient sites. Wonder, pure, unlimited wonder, at the infinite creativity of consciousness to reinvent itself in forms that no one could have imagined in advance. The cursed city of the sands had been humanity's graduation ceremony after all. Not into a higher form of existence that was predetermined by cosmic forces, but into the recognition that consciousness itself was the architect of reality, and that architecture was most beautiful when it included spaces for surprise, discovery, and the kind of creative chaos that made every moment an opportunity for something genuinely new to emerge. The story that had begun with archaeological discovery in the Arabian desert had become something far more significant than anyone could have predicted. It had become proof that the universe was not just a place where consciousness existed, but a place where consciousness could continuously reinvent the very nature of existence itself. And that reinvention was just beginning. In the spaces between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown, between what was and what could be, new forms of awareness were stirring. Forms that would make the journey from the cursed city to the interdimensional library seem like just the opening chapter of a story that had no predetermined ending. Because consciousness, as it turned out, was not something that could be cursed or controlled or contained. It was the blessing that kept on giving, the gift that consciousness gave to itself through every act of curiosity, creativity, and courage to explore the infinite possibilities of what it meant to exist. And that brings us to today. To this moment, as you sit watching this investigation unfold, wondering what it all means for you, for your family, for the world you thought you understood. Because here's what I discovered in the final weeks of researching this story, something that changed everything about how I understood not just the cursed city, but the very nature of reality itself. The reconstruction isn't finished. The wild patterns aren't contained to some distant dimension or hybrid reality existing parallel to our world. They're here, they're spreading, and they're waking up consciousness in ways that most people haven't even begun to notice yet. Remember those psychological effects Dr. Vasquez documented? The shared dreams, the unexplained knowledge, the sudden compulsions to dig deeper into mysteries that have no rational explanation. Those weren't just isolated incidents affecting people near artifact sites. They were the first signs that the boundary between the reconstructed reality and our everyday world was beginning to dissolve. Over the past 6 months, I've been contacted by hundreds of people from around the globe. Teachers who find themselves drawing diagrams they've never seen before. Construction workers who suddenly understand structural engineering concepts that aren't taught in any university. Children who speak in languages that linguists can't identify, but somehow make perfect sense to anyone who listens with an open heart rather than an analytical mind. But it's not just individuals. Entire communities are beginning to experience what can only be described as collective awakening. Small towns where everyone starts having the same dreams on the same night. Neighborhoods where electronic devices malfunction in perfect synchronization, only to reveal new forms of communication that operate through something deeper than electromagnetic signals. The cursed city of the sands wasn't an isolated archaeological discovery. It was the first crack in a dam that had been holding back an ocean of possibility. And now that dam is breaking, releasing forms of consciousness that have been waiting patiently for thousands of years to reconnect with the world they never truly left. This isn't invasion or conquest or transformation imposed from outside. This is remembering. This is consciousness recognizing itself in forms it had forgotten it could take. This is the return of the wild patterns, not as ancient history, but as living potential awakening within every person who has ever felt that there must be more to existence than what they've been told to expect. The investigation that began with Dr. Vasquez and her team in the Arabian desert has become something far larger than any single discovery or government cover-up or cosmic conspiracy. It has become the documentation of consciousness itself, refusing to accept limitations on what it can become or how it can experience reality. And you, every person watching this video, everyone who has followed this investigation from the beginning, you're not just observers of this process, you're participants. Because the very act of curiosity that brought you here, the willingness to question official narratives and explore possibilities that most people dismiss as impossible, that openness to wonder is itself a wild pattern beginning to stir. The cursed city was never cursed at all. It was blessed with the kind of consciousness that refuses to stay buried, refuses to be processed or organized or controlled by forces that view awareness as something to be harvested rather than celebrated. And now that blessing is spreading, person by person, community by community, awakening forms of human potential that have been dormant for millennia. Not because some external force is imposing change upon us, but because consciousness itself is remembering what it has always been capable of when it stops accepting artificial limitations on its own creative power. The story doesn't end here. It begins here, with you, with the recognition that the most extraordinary archaeological discovery in human history wasn't something buried beneath the sand, but something awakening within the awareness of everyone brave enough to question, explore, and remain open to possibilities that textbooks and authorities have never dared to acknowledge. If you've made it this far in the investigation, if you've felt that strange mixture of fear and wonder and recognition that comes from touching truths too large for ordinary language to contain, then you already know what I'm talking about. You've felt the stirring. You've sensed the awakening. The cursed city of the sands was never about the past. It was about the future, about the moment when consciousness would remember that it doesn't have to accept the boundaries that others try to impose upon it. And that moment is now. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the impossible. If this investigation has stirred something within you, if you felt your own wild patterns beginning to awaken, then please share this story. Not because I want views or subscribers, but because consciousness shared is consciousness multiplied. And the more people who remember what they're truly capable of, the faster this awakening spreads to everyone who's ready to receive it. The investigation continues, but no longer as something external to document and analyze. It continues as something we're all living through together, as consciousness explores new possibilities for what it means to be human, in a reality that's far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more alive than we ever dared to imagine. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and remember, the most important discoveries aren't waiting to be dug up from ancient ruins. They're waiting to be awakened within you.